Good afternoon. My name is Furchtgott-Roth. I'll be your moderator today. Just one brief administrative note. Our next event will be June 25th. Here we'll have Commissioner Michael O'Reilly of the Federal Communications Commission who will be speaking about capping the Federal Universal Service Fund. Today we're very honored to have with us Professor Philip Hamburger of Columbia University Law School. He is the Maurice and Hilda Friedman Professor of Law. He is, in my view, the leading authority on administrative law in the United States, and we are very pleased to have him here at Hudson today. He's going to be speaking about a provocative topic, which I either purposefully or due to carelessness got wrong. I think we probably have it backwards. We probably have really the constitutional case for not having Section 501c3 today, but Professor Hamburger, please.
Thank you. Thank you. And I must say, I thought that was a brilliant way of luring people in, right? So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. This, I should say, is a talk that will draw on a book that I published recently with the University of Chicago Press called Liberal Suppression, 501c3 and the Taxation of Speech. It's a bright, beautiful day out there, and yet here we are talking about a revenue subsection. And this is maybe a reflection of the perverted tastes of people who live in Washington, D.C., and no doubt my perverted taste in spending 3 years writing on, again, a single revenue subsection. But of course, it's not just any revenue subsection, is it? It's one that most people are at least vaguely aware of, even if not by its number, because they have some sense that churches and churchy organizations perhaps shouldn't or don't speak in politics. And for someone who studies constitutional law, this is a bit of a puzzle. 501 seems very normal to many people. But why, if we have a First Amendment and if we take it seriously, some such doesn't just jive very well? And with that in mind, I began this as a brief memo. I realized I had an inkling as to what was going on, and before I knew it, I was devoting most of my life to this, which I have some regrets about, but too late now. Any rate, what is 501c3? It's a section of the tax code that exempts religious, educational, and other charitable organizations from the federal income tax. There are other organizations that are exempted, but that's the gist of it. Those are the central organizations. At the same time, though, it denies them this exemption if they engage in campaign speech for or against candidates, or if they devote a substantial part of activities to propaganda or other attempts to influence legislation. So churches and churchy organizations are faced with something of a conundrum, a Hobson's choice. They can choose to speak or they can choose to be exempt from the federal income tax. And that's actually, I was about to say it's a tough choice, but it isn't actually. Most churches simply say, okay, we'll take our exemption and we'll just quiet ourselves down. And that's a strange thing, to have a higher tax rate as long as one silences oneself. Because, from a tax lawyer's perspective, and I used to be a tax lawyer, it's not, these are just differences in tax rates, whatever words we use to describe them. And so you get a different tax rate depending on whether you speak in politics. And the restriction on the speech is rather curious and worth emphasizing up front. It's not that they're not allowed to speak about politics. They can. They're free to speak politically outside political contests, but not in politics. That's pretty curious already in itself. So, how should we begin to understand this? I'd like to begin in a way that I think would make fellow scholars of tax a little uncomfortable, but forgive me, I think it's necessary because as it happens, and this is how I got into this, my tax practice was very different. It was in reorgs and stuff like that. But I happen to have spent more time, I think, than any other law professor in the country studying the KKK. So I want to begin with, I'm not sure the word gentleman is right, a man called Hiram Evans, who used to be very well known in this town. His office was at the southwest corner of Farragut Square, 1700 I Street. So in 1921, a group of Klansmen in Dallas enter the Adolphus Hotel. They find the bellhop, Alexander Johnson, who happens to be black. They drag him out, they take him down to a river, they whip him, and they use acid to carve the letters KKK into his forehead. I know most discussions of tax don't begin this way, but that's the grim reality. The man who probably led this group was Hiram Evans. Hiram Evans was a dentist, a man with a broad smile. You can look him up on the web. When I say he had a broad smile, this is understatement. He had a warm, amazingly broad smile. He was a very engaging, very smart man. Being a dentist, he probably had access to acid. In any case, his exploits in Dallas earned him the next year elevation to the highest possible position. He became, in 1922, the Imperial Wizard of the KKK. And it was through his brilliant understanding of American society and of theology that he managed to make the KKK probably one of the most popular organizations in the United States. And we're not just talking about the Deep South. You may have prejudices about the Deep South. Oh, that's KKK land. No, the KKK was everywhere. The KKK is in the far west. The KKK is in New York State. Every little town in New York State almost had not only a men's group, but a women's auxiliary. We should always remember women contribute to the KKK at least as much as men. I believe in equality, and we should have equal recognition. In any case, Hiram Evans has a powerful understanding of the potential of the KKK and leads it to success. He has offices here. He joins the Congressional Country Club and hobnobs with all the folks who work on the Hill. Now, what's interesting about him for our purposes is what happens towards the end of his reign as Imperial Wizard. In 1930, by which time the Klan, by the way, was in decline. Won't bore you with why. Suffice to say, it was in rapid decline in late 20s. By 1930, he's desperately trying to reach out to a broader audience to revive matters. And he writes a book called The Rising Storm. And in it, he talks about the danger from churches, particularly, of course, the Catholic Church, but more generally of all churches. And he asks, and we're going to quote, whether a church can be allowed to organize political machinery on a religious basis, and whether it may use its spiritual authority to coerce voters or members who are in public office. You understand what he's saying. He's saying there should be limits on the ability of churches to persuade voters and legislators. And this is the first time that I can tell anyone suggests what are to become the dual limitations in 501c3. Now, he's not the only one. These are common tropes in nativist literature at the time. A guy called William Marshall is actually more explicit in tying at least one of these limits to the tax code. He was an Episcopal gentleman in New York who took a rather rabid dislike to Al Smith and became the most prominent writer against him and ends up corresponding with Hiram Evans. Interestingly, Hiram Evans, and again, he's no fool, whatever you may think of his morals, he understood that the arguments in favor of limiting churches and church organizations or speech has to be stated in almost philosophic terms. And he also understood that what he was doing was, as he put it, these are not my words, but as he would put it, a matter of liberalism. As he said, I'm taking one of his harsher statements, we must make Catholics know the American meaning of freedom, equality, and liberalism. Now, before we go on, and we're going to delve into more conventional areas of 501c3 scholarship shortly, but you might just be wondering, whoa, wait a minute, why associate the Klan with liberalism? And of course, I'm just quoting the Imperial Wizard of the Klan. So why is the Imperial Wizard identifying with liberalism and trying to get Americans to be more liberal? Something doesn't compute here, right? And so my first thought I want to share with you, and this is why Hiram Evans is so illuminating, is that perhaps we have a misunderstanding of the Klan and of liberalism. The liberalism he's talking about is theological liberalism, which has been bound into our more familiar cultural and political liberalism, but was by far the most dominant form of liberalism in America in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but suffice it to say that one of Hiram Evans' most brilliant moves was to understand the Klan could become popular, not merely in selling, gear. They sold a lot of robes and hats and made a lot of money that way. But by marketing the Klan as a theologically liberal institution. It's not, many people say, oh, the Klan, the fundamentalists, this is a gross defamation of fundamentalists. The Klan was theologically liberal in the sense that it was distrustful of organized religion and was offering an ecumenical vision of individuals' relationship to God. And once one wraps one's mind around that, a lot becomes clear, pleasantly and unpleasantly. So let's shift gears. I think I've got your attention with the KKK. Now we can be more concrete about American organizations. First thing to note is that traditionally, churches and churchy organizations are very active in politics in this country. And if you want to, we can talk about anything from the civil rights movement to my lifetime back to the anti-slavery movement. They're key. And this was recognized most profoundly by de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville, French aristocrat, comes to this country and recognizes that what's happening here is remarkable. He points out in France, if you want to gather people in opposition to government or in favor of a good cause, you have to circle around an aristocrat. He was familiar with this. He was an aristocrat. In America, we have no aristocrats. And so the way people organize is through voluntary organizations and, of course, primarily the churches. But at the same time that he's writing about this in the 1820s and 30s, there's developing in America a theological movement, liberal theology, that takes a rather different point of view. And from that perspective, one should have some anxiety about the authority of any claimed by any church leader, and any dogma. Such things seemed a threat to the mental freedom of individuals in relationship to God, a threat to their faith. If I'm overawed by the assertions of my clergymen, how can I be really following what I believe in conscience? And thus my salvation may be jeopardized by harsh public statements or claims for the theological authority of churches. And this sort of liberal authority, if you want to read some of this, some of it's very eloquent. You read William Channing. He writes a wonderful sermon in 1830 on the subject. You can find it on the web. This was read, by the way, by John Stuart Mill and becomes the basis of some of his work On Liberty, where he talks about the threat of custom and public opinion. In America, theological liberalism, this distrust of churchy speech, gets something of a nativist twist. In the 1840s, nativist organizations are formed in opposition to Catholic immigrants, and the nativists adopt a theologically liberal stance against the Catholic Church. Many nativists are not themselves theologically liberal, but it's a good argument against Catholics. And they end up arguing against the authority of the Pope, even though they might accept the authority of their own minister. And so nativism becomes theologically liberal, and it infects theological liberalism, whereas theological liberalism begins as out of concern for the individual and their faith. The nativism adds to it a concern for the demos and the democracy, because, of course, if a clergyman or church can influence your vote, maybe it will undermine democracy if it's particularly successful, hence the fear of the Pope, etc. Now, how do all of these anxieties lead to 501c3? Well, what begins in the 19th century just continues into the 20th, just with larger platforms and louder voices. Remember the language of 501c3. The first limitation on speech is added in 1934, the passed of Senator Reed, and it concerns propaganda to influence legislation. Propaganda, that's strange language for the US Code. Where does it come from? Well, it's quite common in contemporary nativist literature to complain about Catholic and other church propaganda and its influence on democratic society and legislation. The language of the code is taken directly out of nativist tracts. It's uncanny. And so if you're wondering about the influence of nativism, you can just read it in the US Code. The language is almost precisely the same. And that's just one section that limits speech. There's another one that limits campaigning, added in 1954, 20 years later, by LBJ. And that's often said to be in response to criticism he receives from conservatives. Actually, some of the criticism came from Mexican American Catholics. He didn't like that. There's an anti-Catholic element there too. There's also a slightly different set of nativist tropes. This has to do with segregation. This gets very interesting. We can only touch on details here. We can go more in questions if we want. Liberals were very worried, especially theological liberals, are very worried about segregation in the 1920s. But the segregation that really gets them going, unbelievably, is not racial segregation. It's the segregation of Catholics from the American populace in parochial schools. The Catholics withdraw their kids from public schools and put them into Catholic schools and thereby segregate them. There's endless literature on this. So the goal was to force all kids into public schools. The Klan and the Democratic Party get this passed in Oregon, but in Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the Supreme Court holds this unconstitutional. And this leads to a problem for nativists. What's the next step? Well, if you can't segregate if you can't desegregate children in public schools, at least perhaps the speech of ecclesiastical and other idealistic organizations can be segregated from politics. And so in 1954, when LBJ faces opposition, and of course he just wants to slap it down through the IRS, he says, well, okay, let's also prevent campaigning. And it's no coincidence this happens in 1954, the same year as Brown versus Board, but we can talk about that later. In any case, by 1954, we have these dual limits. Churches can speak politically as much as they want, just not in trying to persuade voters or legislators. Okay, I'd like to wrap up by saying just a little bit about the constitutional questions, because this is abundantly clear. It's abundantly clear that this is unconstitutional, and the real question is, why have we not noticed? Why has it become normalized? Now, why do I say it's abundantly clear it's unconstitutional? Let's suppose that this is, as many people say, it's just a condition on public funding. There are all sorts of conditions in public spending. There's another condition in public spending. If they don't want the money, the tax expenditure, as it came to be called, as Stanley Suri called it, they don't have to take it. If you take it, it comes with those conditions. Well, the doctrine of the Supreme Court on conditions is a little vague, but it's not so vague that we can't see what's going on here. There are two requirements that, again, are very clear from Supreme Court doctrine. A condition has to be germane and has to be proportional. That's not much, but at least we know that. Well, in what way is the speech limitation germane to exemption from the tax code? Not clear at all. And is it proportional to impose a speech condition on all churches that get exemption, even if they have only marginal benefits from the exemption? So, for example, you can imagine a church getting a very wealthy church with a lot of income, getting a major tax benefit from an exemption. But 90% of churches get a tiny, tiny benefit from the exemption. Some get none at all, and yet if they're 501c3s, they have to give up their political speech. The very lack of gradation in the limitation makes it not proportional at all. Now, the counter to this, of course, is, well, that exemption, it's tied also to the deduction in Section 170. There's a deduction for donors. When you give money, some of you I hope will become wealthy, and give to institutions of all sorts, perhaps churches, and then you get a deduction from your taxes. And to prevent that from becoming an avenue for essentially the washing out taxes from political money, we have to have these limitations on speech, which indeed are echoed in 170. But notice, this doesn't really quite work for the exemption, because you could prevent this sort of political washing of money simply by limiting the deductions to the donors if their money is misused. There's no need to limit the speech of the organizations receiving money. This is entirely disproportionate, not germane. Now, that's just if this is a condition. I would suggest we should rethink whether this is really an ordinary condition. So imagine the federal government did this. They said, no, we don't have Section 501c3. We're simply going to pay cash to churches if they shut up. You have a church? We want you to shut up. Here's $100,000. Thank you. You have a church? $100,000. Shut up. And now I think we have no doubt, the moment we put it that way, this is unconstitutional. This is a 9-0 case. So what's different when you simply have a tax exemption? In fact, it's even worse because I can choose to get extra money and give up my speech or not. At least my money's being bought. If I'm facing different tax rates depending on my silence, it's an entirely different proposition. I'm being told you get a higher tax, or you choose between essentially taxes and speech, and this makes it all the more disturbing. So I think this is not even a condition of the ordinary sort. And this becomes abundantly clear when it turns out, as is the case, the traditional view is the tax exemption merely is a measure of the baseline for the income tax. And it's only because of theological propaganda since mid-century that's come to be viewed as a benefit. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Suffice it to say, this section in speech limitations has the most egregious origins in prejudice that has not been recognized. And when you recognize that, at least should sober one up enough to think about applying constitutional doctrine. And when you do that in a sober, straightforward way, it's hard to see that these speech limitations are constitutional. I'm gonna finally close. When I say I'm gonna close, I'm gonna keep on going. I'm gonna really close though by mentioning a Supreme Court case, Reagan versus Taxation of the Representation, 1983, held that the so-called lobbying, really the propaganda restriction, was constitutional. And everyone says, well, it's a done deal. Why talk about this anymore? It's settled. You're not going to overturn that. Well, two thoughts. First, that only applies to the propaganda element, not to the campaigning. Second, let me quote to you from the case. The Supreme Court itself said in that case, the case would be different if Congress were to discriminate invidiously in its subsidies in such a way as to aim at the suppression of dangerous ideas. Well, that is exactly what the speech limitations were designed to do. Church speech was viewed as dangerous by nativists, including the Klan, and that's why we have it in the US Code. Thank you.
I'm going to take, yeah, we will. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. You speak about, you focused on churches in your discussion, and 501c3 entities are far more than churches, and some of them have decidedly political views. Universities come to mind. They may not have openly political endorsements as an institution, but they may offer platforms to some candidates and not to others. They may have hiring practices that are clearly political in nature. They may have their investment funds that focus on political objectives. They're 501c3s. Are they treated differently from churches? Or,
Right. I think it's fair to say that it's not just churches. That's why I said churches and church organizations. The original target were organizations that speak with authority, and so could fit within the model, theologically liberal model of what was to be feared. By the way, already in the early 19th century, that's extended to business organizations, including by people like James Madison in his so-called detached memoranda about 1820. And indeed, today, there's a lot of suspicion of corporate speech true. So there's a lot of fear of the speech of our fellow citizens when pursued in an organized fashion. It seemed to be more dangerous than government. So yes, why not include universities? And indeed, the code does. These are the educational organizations as put by the code. The IRS, on the whole, doesn't want to press this issue. So whether you're a church or a university, you can usually evade their scrutiny by saying only roughly within the guidelines. And of course, the code does not prevent all sorts of political maneuvers, including the discrimination I think you alluded to. It's just propaganda to influence legislation. and campaigning for or against candidates. And so it focuses very concretely on the representative system of government that we have. And other political speech is fine, including some that one might view as utterly reprehensible. And I would defend reprehensible speech by reprehensible people any day. If I may just throw in a little plug here. So not only do I teach, I'm also president of the New Civil Liberties Alliance. We aim to pick up where the ACLU leaves off. All the stuff they no longer do, we do. And defending people who speak and get punished is a central part of what we like to do. We also are particularly concerned about the administrative state, which is a central threat to all sorts of civil liberties. So yes, I don't mind reprehensible universities doing reprehensible things. That's probably the best they can do, but I shouldn't go down that line. Yes?
Please, identify every question, please identify yourself. We have an online audience and everyone needs to know who the questions are coming from.
Augustus Alzona, A-L-Z-O-N-A. Thank you very much, sir, for helping connect the dots for individuals like myself. I'm a CPA certified, current and active license, but played a lot of roles in the last election too, presidential election. I just thought basically just an observation, and there's a question. It would seem that the so-called religious right here in the U.S. was also probably the major opponents of slavery and other such acts, going back to, I guess, to over the last century or so, and that would include the Catholic Church, institution. And I can attest to, and having heard stories, for example, where 501c3 was used as a bludgeon, certainly against the Catholic Church to keep it from speaking out against gay marriage, and other, well, also abortion too. Those two big issues, which are going to be big issues, at least in this century. But my question is this: do you advocate? Are you saying that we should basically abolish the whole 501c3 statute and just go back to having free speech as probably intended by the founding fathers?
Thank you very much. Two thoughts about this. You spoke about the religious right and the past and slavery, and I confess, whatever one thinks about right or left today, I'm a little uncomfortable applying that contemporary terminology to the past. I don't know that orthodoxy corresponds to being contemporary religious right. In the 19th century, certainly many churches that were theologically orthodox, and of course it's roughly orthodox given that Calvinism is somewhat fading in the 19th century. Many of them were indeed opposed to slavery, but some supported it. But also many theologically liberal organizations, including Unitarians, opposed slavery. In fact, slavery united many the liberal and orthodox in profound ways, which is one of the reasons I think that it's only after the Civil War that you actually get proposals to start silencing fellow churches. So I think both left and right have much to contribute, and the theologically liberal and theologically orthodox have much to contribute. It depends on the issue, and I hesitate to generalize about one or the other and their merits. But I certainly do endorse the idea of free speech for everybody, regardless of their views. It's the only way we're going to learn, right? We can't enter into an assumption that one knows everything ahead of time. That's why I want to hear the speech of people I disagree with. And I wouldn't go so far as to abolish 501c3, except to remove the speech limits. There's actually an interesting question as to whether constitutionally one can remove the exemption. That's a big can of worms we didn't go into. Because it was probably understood as a baseline, even for constitutional purposes. But again, we needn't pursue that now. Suffice it to say, the speech limits were added much later at the behest of people like the Klan and people who liked those ideas. And there's no harm in getting rid of those, I think.
Gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Herman Bauma. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Objectivity in the Teaching of Evolutionary Theory. And with respect to the issue of the fact that contributions to a 501c3 are tax deductible, I always thought that was a good argument for the limitation on political activity of a 501c3, because if you contribute to a political party, you can't deduct that for income tax purposes. So to me, it made some sense because contributions to a 501c3 are tax deductible. The limitation made some sense. I didn't quite understand your response to that. Mm-hmm. And one other issue, you make a big deal out of the fact that 501c3s are tax exempt. But I've always wondered, I mean, contributions, donations are gifts, and under the code, gifts are not includable in income in the first place. So is it really that big of a benefit to be a 501c3 tax exempt entity?
Yeah, and let's take those in reverse. I think you're quite right. I don't have the numbers, but most churches do not have that much income. They have gifts, which is a different matter altogether. Actual income, usually investment income of some sort, is found among some of the older and wealthier churches. But that's a small, it's not a big deal for many churches. It is a big deal for some. And there may be constitutional proportions to this that we needn't pursue here. This probably is a measure of the baseline. It certainly was so understood by Cordell Hull and all sorts of people who were early involved in the tax code. But whether it makes a big difference for churches, 90% of churches or some percentage like that is indeed, as you suggest, an open question. Probably not. Now, the really interesting point you raise is about deductions. That's right. So the standard fallback justification of the speech limits tied to the exemption is that this is really a way of enforcing a sort of campaign limits, right? And what one doesn't want to see, and I think there are good reasons for not wanting to see this, is to have a donation, a charitable donation, be the source of a tax deduction used for political purposes, because in a sense then the federal government is subsidizing one class of political contributions and not others. That would be disturbing, to put it mildly. So I think we're entirely in accord on that. The question is, what's the right remedy? And one basic principle of First Amendment and generally Bill of Rights jurisprudence is one wants to take the lesser restriction rather than the greatest possible restriction, right? So we have to have restrictions that are so-called narrowly tailored, to use the court's language. I'm not terribly fond of that language, but there's a useful principle in there. So think about it. If you're worried about contributions being somehow subsidized by the federal government, you have two obvious avenues. One is simply to silence the churches. But that's not the most obvious solution. That's the one that places the greatest burden, indeed burden on institutions that are merely sort of the conduit there, right? The narrowest solution is simply to deny the deduction. So for example, suppose one wants to give money to a church, and one wants to wants the money to be deductible. What do? You give it to, let's say, an account that is dedicated to non-political ends, non-campaigns, and not too much petitioning or talking to Congress about legislation. Then the IRS can be fully satisfied the money is not being used, and you can get your deduction. Or if there isn't some specialized fund in your 501c3 that you're giving to, you give them a donation and ask for a letter a year later that it was not used in an appropriate way or from an accountant, right? And show that to the IRS, and you get your deduction a year later. So there are mechanisms that could allow us to solve this problem that don't involve silencing anyone. The idea that in order to deal with campaign speech campaign contribution problems, you have to silence organizations in their speech. Indeed, the organizations you select for this are, of all organizations, idealistic organizations. That's pretty weird, isn't it? When you can much more simply deny deduction to folks whose donations are misused. So there's a very simple mechanism. And of course, that's not the one that's being used, because that wouldn't have served the purpose everyone had in mind, which was to silence these organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob Lean. In that regard that you were talking about apportioning deductions, with my bar dues, I notice that I make the payment and it'll say before I check out, you can deduct $5.95 for political purposes. So can that type of idea be used to follow up on what you've just said?
That's a lovely example. Now, of course, it's being done there for other purposes, right? They're trying to deal with the Supreme Court precedent having to do with forced speech. But absolutely, that's when you computerize it, it gets even easier. Exactly.
Gentleman next to him.
Good afternoon. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. Welcome to the Hudson Institute, Professor. We're happy to have you. Let's discuss Willard Romney, the current Utah senator who was also a former senator in Massachusetts, who ran for president, became the Republican nominee, and got completely destroyed by President Obama in those debates. That guy. So when he was at Harvard, what he said was, well, I'm smart, I want to be president one day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell everybody I'm a Mormon and that's my religion and that's what I believe, because nobody knows what that is. And I can just tell everybody to donate to all my charities and I'll just use that money and build on it and build on it and build on it. Then when I'm a senator, I can use that money to run for president and no one can call me on it because everything is tax deductible. And what I'm asking you is, what can we do at a university level in the upper echelon colleges like Columbia, like Howard University, American University, Georgetown? What can we do to reverse the thinking that gives students the confidence to plan out their lives based on these kinds of loopholes and incentives that not everyone knows about? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I don't know enough about Romney to comment on him personally, and I wouldn't be inclined. That's just not my style. But I think you raise a very important question about students. You talk about their confidence in planning out their lives. I'm not sure the tax code is the major culprit here, right? The main culprit, I think, is the hubris that has been human nature for eons, right? The Greeks had something to say about this. One sees all sorts of things. Since, as a teacher, one gets to know students not only in a formal sense in lectures, but also as individuals. And it's sometimes painful to see extremes either of lack of confidence sometimes, which can be very debilitating, or of overconfidence. They know what they want, they know how their life, and sometimes, astonishingly, there are those people who can plan out their lives successfully. In my admittedly limited experience, life never works out as planned, and sometimes that's a blessing, and sometimes not. I won't bore you with my personal experiences, but I have a theory about this. And forgive me, it's not what you were looking for in terms of policy. I don't have a policy answer. But I have a theory that we sufficiently misunderstand ourselves that we're all probably, or almost all of us, are at our best or most fortunate when we step out just a little bit beyond our understanding of ourselves, but not too far to go adrift. Anyway, more personal an answer than you probably expected, but it seems to me the confidence you talk about is very worrisome. And here, let's go back to the main topic of my talk. We talk about churches. So churches traditionally taught a certain humility, right? Both as sort of a contained confidence within the realm of what it is to be human. That's no longer taught at universities because universities are no longer religious institutions. In some senses, that's good. It means there's more room for people, different points of view. On the other hand, it may be that universities do ever so little these days to help people be successful in true sense, which probably has little to do with being president. Anyway, far adrift from our conversation, yet not really. So thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Matt Denhart from the Coolidge Foundation. I was wondering, you didn't get to this in your talk, and I'm not sure if your research is focused much on this, so if it's not relevant, please just tell me. But I was hoping you might be able to comment some on the 1969 changes to some of the tax code related to nonprofits, and particularly around creation of donor-advised funds and supporting organizations and some of the rules that are still in effect today, and if that relates in any way to what you presented here.
I hadn't thought about that. I don't know. I'll have to think more about it. Tell me more about what you're thinking about.
So in 1969, you saw Congress really look more closely at the separation within 501c3s. And I'm not certainly an expert in this. I'm trying to learn more myself, but created different divisions, and now there are things called A1, A2, and A3 organizations, all within the 509A code, and those being public charities, private foundations, and supporting organizations. And then even within those, there are donor-advised funds, and then separately there's supporting organizations. The specific thing that I wonder about is that there is something called a public support ratio that public charities must meet, and it makes it all government money that is given or somehow earned by a nonprofit counts as public support, but any kind of substantial gifts from a single contributor does not count towards your ratio. I'm getting way into the weeds here, I realize.
Okay. So I now understand what you're talking about. That's right. There have been a host of changes that create rather sharp divisions. I'm not sure this directly connects to these speech limitations, but let's just pursue it nonetheless. This can be dangerous. And one reason is that organizations that fall into one category may want to flip over into another. The most extraordinary example of this sort of thing involved the Pew, which was desperate to become a charity, not be a foundation. Now, there are administrative reasons for this. If you're a foundation, you have to spend by a certain amount of time. If you're a charity, you can go on ad infinitum. And what they did is they took over the Barnes Foundation, so they would have contributors every week in downtown Philadelphia. If you know about the Barnes Foundation? Okay. And it's one of the greatest, it's really it's akin to theft. It's really a travesty. An educational institution adopted by somebody who was outside of the Philadelphia elite, who aligned himself with African American institutions in Pennsylvania, set up an institution that belonged to, I think it was Lincoln College, and they were forced to give it up through mechanisms that are not altogether savory. But what's interesting about this is not just what happened at Barnes, but the idea that institutions, once the IRS sets categories, institutions then have interests in flipping from one category to another. And this is the sort of problem, I want to bring this all back to my talk. This is one of the reasons we have to worry a little bit about what's happening in 501c3. The Supreme Court has begun to treat tax classifications as constitutional classifications for speech. And the reality is the Internal Revenue Code should not drive how we think about free speech. We've ended up thinking about free speech in terms of the specialization of one's organization. If you're a business organization, you have a certain amount of free speech, but not full free speech. If you're an individual, you have full free speech. If you're a university, you have partial speech. If you're a church, you have religious speech, but maybe not some other speech. If you're a business organization, of course, you don't have full religious liberty, but you can have the certain amount of free speech. In other words, our First Amendment rights are getting sliced and diced. We have a vision of specialization, which have the specialized version of the speech rights or religious rights that correspond to the IRS category of your institution. And for this reason, I think we have to be deeply suspicious. These sort of requirements may serve a function purpose of the IRS. We should never identify rights holders in these terms. Put another way, the First Amendment is written generally. And notice, it's when Congress shall make no law, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't identify the rights holders. And this is why Citizens United was probably the right decision. It's not simply that corporations are persons as a matter of law. It's one of the main reasons of having a corporation. But also, the right isn't limited to anybody in particular. Only persons can have standing. But the First Amendment denies power to Congress. It's not about allocating rights to this group or not that group. So without quite answering your question, I think it points to a symptom that's very, very, very worrisome. Thank you.
Gentleman in the red tie.
Thank you. My name's Dominic Pino. I was wondering how a different kind of 501c3 you haven't mentioned yet in your story, research institutions, think tanks like the one we're currently assembled in. I was just curious as to how that fits into your story and the creation of 501c4, which allows advocacy, it allows more speech. They can run campaign ads, endorse candidates, things like that, and how those are normally affiliated with a 501c3 research arm.
Right. Well, as to think tanks, I think it's quite clear they should all be silenced, right? No, more seriously. But just saying that reminds one of what we're talking about here. We're talking about telling people to shut up, which just cannot be constitutional. Right, so the whole host of organizations that are included, the way in my book I identify them is largely as idealistic organizations. If you think about the basic divisions that the Internal Revenue Code imposes on our world, they divide the world very roughly between the ones that make money for themselves and the ones that are sort of promoting ideas that are idealistic in one way or another. And there's some that don't quite fit in one way. The unions occupy a funny position, and perhaps it was a mistake to think of them as self-serving. They're not. Those are idealistic institutions too, fundamentally. And the membership organizations get complicated in all of this. But the major division is between the business and the idealistic. And once you think of it in those terms, and of course those aren't tax terms. The tax term is profit and nonprofit. But the nonprofits are essentially idealistic. When you think of those terms, you realize the importance of this and what's at stake, which is that we're placing burdens on the idealistic speech. And it's no surprise that politicians and people who are suspicious of those idealistic organizations and don't want them proposing ideas that might impinge on one's sense of individuality, that you want to shut them up. If you think about it, business organizations are okay for a politician. You know, everything's just a matter of compromise. They don't like your legislation, that's okay. You do some bargaining, and ultimately it's just a matter of money. You can do business with business organizations. Can you do business with, let's say, a Pentecostal church? Can you do business with the Catholic Church when it's opposed to slavery, or a Unitarian Church when it's opposed to slavery? The answer is no. And that drove politicians nuts in the 19th century because they thought it was just so unreasonable of these churches to want an immediate abolition of slavery. But of course, that was the virtue of having these organizations, their speech. So, right, this gets to all these divisions, and it's worrisome when we think in constitutional terms and allows that to infect how we think about our rights. Now, you raise a very interesting point. What about the alternative avenues for speech? Because you don't have to just go through 501c3. There's the C4 organizations, and then there are 527 PACs, and usually you have a little trilogy. You get your C3, then you create a C4, and then it creates a 527 PAC, and bingo, you have a little bit more speech. Two thoughts about this. First of all, you're still not free from the IRS. The reality is the C4s have to be careful that their campaigning is not a primary activity. Now, usually it won't be, but do you really think slavery was defeated by treating slavery as a secondary activity? Many churches turned into anti-slavery machines. That's why we're free. That's why we have a free society. And we should never kid ourselves about that. And of course, imagine the church of social conscience. You know, I've invented that church, but you understand it. Everything is about campaigning and lobbying and persuading about the here and now, not about the hereafter. And then of course, 527 PACs and C4s can't go beyond their social welfare purpose. No one knows what this means. The IRS doesn't want to clarify it, but it lingers as a worry whenever you're giving advice to these organizations. So the first point is, you're not entirely free with these organizations. Second, and more seriously, what is free speech? Does it mean your message gets out, albeit through another mechanism? Suppose I came in here and I just showed some words to Harold, and Harold said them for me. Harold would be my ventriloquist. He speaks for himself, but let's just pretend he's kind enough to serve as sort of a wooden dummy here. It doesn't suit him, but let's pretend. He would say things much more eloquently than I. He has a finer voice. He's much more presentable in many ways. And yet it wouldn't be my voice, right? Now imagine you're a church, and You're committed to God, and your salvation depends on speaking in your voice about your faith to God in public. Does it help to have Harold, however fine his voice? And the answer is no, because it's not your voice. It is fundamentally incompatible with religious liberty to say that you can speak through another organization, let alone an IRS contraption, such as a C4 or 527. And in terms of constitutional law, think about what free speech is. It's not just free speech as in freedom of the message. It is a freedom to speak. My free speech is my freedom to speak. Your free speech is your freedom to speak. And the IRS should not be able to take that away. So this sounds like a technical matter, C4s, 527s. It's not. It gets to the heart of who we are and our identity.
Gentleman in the back.
My name is Don Kirk. I'm a journalist. How does all this relate to the, say, anti-war movement or peace movement? The Quakers, American Friends Service Committee on one hand, and other organizations on the other hand. Have there been cases where they've tried to, take away the tax, that is the tax exemptions from some of these organizations?
He's clearly more or less my generation. That's right. I don't know if people still know about these organizations, but they were vigorously involved in the 1960s in connection with the Vietnam War. The first question got to this, yes. It's increasingly become a tactic in local politics to write to the IRS and say, hey, those pastors who are opposing me because, let's say I'm pro-abortion or whatever, they're talking politics. You should write a letter to them, tell them to shut up. And by the way, this is what LBJ did when he was opposed by some conservative organizations. He wrote to the IRS commissioner and said, you should investigate these people. The IRS commissioner, to his credit, came back and said, they haven't quite violated 501c3. Sorry, LBJ. Next day, LBJ has someone up on the Hill draft the additional limitation on speech in 501c3. So, yeah, people misbehave. But the fundamental point here is not that people misbehave, but that government shouldn't be telling people to shut up. That's what allows people to misbehave in this particular way. But ultimately, this is about the US Code, which contains provisions that come directly out of the nativist movement. Indeed, the most charming elements of it, such as the KKK.
Questions? If not, please join me in.
Thank you. Thank you so much.